Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Community Chat, a place where we get some people together and we just talk about important stuff that's happening in the world. And today we're going to be talking about a pretty serious topic that causes me a lot of anxiety personally, and that is, what is our faithful response to gun violence? So it's a little bit heavy today. And I hope that as you're listening, that you too are thinking about your faithful response to gun violence and what we can do as a church, as Community of Christ. So my name is Carla Long. I'm the pastor of the Salt Lake City congregation in Utah. And I live in Eagle Mountain with my husband Kuzma and my two amazingly beautiful children, Leodin and Ari. Next, I'm going to have my co-host, Sean, introduce themselves.
Hello, my name is Sean Langdon. I live in Vancouver, Washington, though am joining this conversation today from Samish Island Campground. And I work as a youth invitation and camping minister for Community of Christ.
Thank you, Sean. Next, Dave Brock.
Yes, Dave Brock from Central Oregon, Redmond, Oregon. I'm retired after 40 years of work with Community of Christ internationally, a lot of that, but around these United States as well.
Thanks, Dave. And last but not least, Tim.
I'm Tim Dodson. I currently live in Michigan. I retired from federal service after 26 years as a federal law enforcement officer. I am a military veteran, and I am a firearms owner. And I recently completed 3 years as a volunteer co-mission center president in the Chesapeake Bay Mission Center, covering Maryland, Virginia, and the District of Columbia.
So it sounds like we all know what it's like to work for the church, even though not all of us are currently working for the church. That's good to know. I do want to say before we get started with this conversation that this conversation is definitely, as you heard, a USA-based conversation. I'm in Utah, Sean and Dave are up in the Pacific Northwest, and Tim is out in Michigan. And so this is not for a worldwide conversation. This is definitely a United States conversation. And I wanted to make that very clear before we really jumped into it. So I don't know who wants to go first, but I'm just going to throw the question out there. What is our faithful response to gun violence?
Well, so since I have the military and the law enforcement background, I'll go for, and I am a firearms owner. I'll go first and basically take a swing at the ball. So personally, for me, my faithful response to gun violence, one is prayer, grieving for those who have been injured by gun violence, but also recognizing that for me, preparation to properly respond to gun violence is part of my faithful response. I've spent my entire adult life as a protector, protecting my fellow citizens and my fellow disciples from those who would do them harm. And so part of my faithful response has been to make sure that I know how firearms are properly stored and taken care of, and how to use them in an emergency situation. They're a tool. From my perspective, they're a tool. They can be used for harm and they can be used for good, but they're an inanimate object. And until somebody picks them up and uses them, they have neither good nor evil. They have no intent whatsoever. And so that's part of what I think we need to remember is while they can be destructive, so can many things within our world. Cars. So for instance, cars. So it's really comes down to individual action and choice that I think we need to focus our response on. But that comes from somebody who's a military veteran and a law enforcement professional.
Yeah, first of all, I just really appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation and appreciate Tim's input and think it's an important topic. I know that statistics, the same statistics can be utilized to prove opposite points. So I understand the challenge of statistics, but I do feel like it's important to lift up a few of those because it's central to a quality conversations. And my perspective is that we do have a gun problem in these United States. More Americans have died from guns since 1975, more than 1.5 million persons, and that's more than all the wars of the U.S. dating back to the Revolutionary War. Uh, Statistics say that there are probably 400 million guns privately owned in the United States today, and we only have 330 million people. The US gun homicide rate is 26 times that of other high income countries. The US has about 5% of the world's population, but we have 42% of the world's privately held guns. And, on and on those statistics go. So I think it's important to acknowledge that, to acknowledge that 6 out of every 10 gun deaths is a suicide. And so there's a lot to deal with that, to address that. Soldiers are among those. Soldiers are being killed by their own gun more often than by the guns of any foreign enemy. Suicide by gun has surpassed war as the military's leading cause of death. Women, access to a gun in domestic violence situations makes it 5 times more likely that a woman will be killed. Children and youth, terrible statistics. But I think we have a heart problem, but we also have a gun problem. And as Tim said, it's important to mourn every life that has been lost. Every time a life is lost, we lose a glimpse of God in the world. And this is not just an issue, it's casualties that have names, faces. It's about a God who suffers with those who suffer, who grieves with those who grieve. We have a gun problem and a heart problem. So those, and I guess another thing I would say, and then I'm going to shut up so Tim can talk again, but it's so politicized these days, and that's why I think it's so important to be able to have a conversation like this where there might be separate, different perspectives, but it's also an opportunity to look for some practical solutions. It's like Tim says, guns can be dangerous, not necessarily. Guns can kill, cars can kill, and so are there practical legislative things that can be done, like to drive a car you have to have a license, to drive a car you have to be of a certain age. Can't we address some of those kinds of things in our laws, our legislation, to just help us? It's like AR-15s. Why does an 18-year-old child need to have access to an AR-15 or a Glock? Just some of those kind of things. So my hope is that we can have just some solid, objective, common solutions that go across political boundaries, that maybe have different perspectives about the Second Amendment, that kind of thing. I think there are ways to do that with respect and with creativity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think before I look at, as I look at the faithful response, I also think about my own journey and how that has shaped my faithful response, what I see as my response as a person of faith as well. And I look back, when I was in middle school, I was a TA in a library as Columbine was happening, and so I had night terrors for years afterwards. Wake up, in a sweat, having these nightmares about gun violence happening in my school. Then when I was at the last peace colloquy, I got a news alert on my phone that there was a shooting at Marysville Pilchuck High School. It was the high school that I graduated from, and come to find out that there were several students killed in the cafeteria. And I saw on the news, kids being evacuated from the classrooms that I once was in, which took me back to Columbine and seeing kids being evacuated out of their windows of the classrooms at the school. And then I'm a huge country music fan, and the shooting in Las Vegas as well, and that jarred me, thinking that that's a concert that I would have been to if I was near Las Vegas. And as a queer person, the Pulse nightclub shootings, mass shooting in Orlando, the time I was closeted when that happened, and it was just a few months before I came out, and it just completely jarred me. And so there was all these experiences that I had that have been attached to violent situations that all involve guns, and that consistently in my life has even though it hasn't been, I haven't personally been around in those situations. I still it shaped my response to this conversation. Now, I grew up in a home where my mom worked for the Everett Police Department here in Washington, and she had a gun. I never saw it. She had a gun though in the house, and my dad has guns as well in his home. So I did grow up around it, but not necessarily. I didn't grow up using it, for example. But when I see these acts of violence at the hands where guns is used, and I struggle because I understand the argument, Tim, that you shared about how they're a tool that can be used for violence, and I get that argument as well, and so I struggle with that, this intertension around that, but recognizing that a lot of things, can be used for violence that maybe are not just for that purpose, but I think that part of the conversation has to do with regulations and consequences, but I think there's definitely a bigger conversation also here at play as well. There's just a lot of different things, and there's a lot of things in our society that we can look at and say, well, what about this and what about that? But as a people that dedicated to the pursuit of peace, I come back to what does it mean to have the scripture that says, become a people of the temple, those who see violence but proclaim peace, who feel conflict yet extend the hand of reconciliation, and who encounter broken spirits and find pathways for healing. And I think that's a scripture that in for us kind of addresses a lot of different aspects of this larger conversation here that we need to be looking at.
Sean, I'm glad you brought up the church. I'm going to talk about a few World Conference resolutions that we've had, actually, and they're kind of old. They're like older World Conference resolutions that we've had. But before I say that, I want to talk about a little bit about my experience. I grew up in Kansas. I'm definitely a farm girl. I grew up on a 40-acre farm. My boyfriend was a hunter in high school, and on dates we used to go hunting, and I'm not even kidding about any of that. So I would be up in a tree stand with a gun, and I see, Tim, I see what you're saying. Like they're not used for evil there. I mean, I guess killing animals some people think is evil, but we would eat those animals. It's not like they would go to waste. So I understand that, all of that stuff. And I do see, coming from a hunting background, my sister and my ex-boyfriend would laugh if they said that I came from a hunting background, but I'm going to go ahead and say that anyway. I can see how the guns are fine and not harmful at all. I do want to read some World Conference resolutions, though. These are some. I'm not going to read them all, but I'm going to read some that maybe will continue our conversation down the road. They are right over here. From 1992, it says, resolved that we intensify our efforts to heal the causes of violence, war, prejudice, discrimination, greed, hunger, and oppression, and be it further resolved that we pledge to anew to forgive, be patient, bring reconciliation, sacrifice for others, suffer with the pain of compassion, and be actively engaged in the pursuit of peace, all as taught to us by Jesus Christ. So that was from 1992, 30 years ago, if you can believe that. One from 2000 says, resolved, that the church encourage in its members a thoughtful and reflective stewardship regarding the use of firearms for professional or for sports purposes, and be it further resolved that the church encourages its membership to renounce the personal use of firearms for all other purposes as a response to the call to recognize the worth of all persons. So in that one, it sounds like we're asking everyone to stop using guns except for professional or sports purposes. Another one in 2000 says that the diverse ways recognized by Community of Christ in which external peace and justice are pursued should include, but not be limited to, the personal and corporate means such as reconciliation, negotiation, mediation, and the use of justifiable force for peacekeeping, protection, and defense. So I don't know if that spurs any more conversation for anyone else, but that is what the church, and that's what we as a worldwide church have said about the use of firearms and how we should be interacting with people.
I think it's interesting to look at the dates when resolutions like this come forward, when we look back at resolutions like this, because the personal use of firearms one came in April 2000. That's a year after Columbine. And so it feels like that was a community for the delegates that were there, because that to me is a really surprising resolution. And I agree with it, but it makes some pretty strong statements there. And I see that as a response to probably what happened in Columbine, is my guess, which we've seen from World Conference resolutions from around, especially I think from the U.S. does it more, but from around the world, where resolutions are put forth in response to what is happening in the culture at the time. So that's just my reflection on that one. It's just the date of it.
Just a couple of comments. One is, Carla, at the beginning, you mentioned that this is a U.S. Focused conversation, but I want to say in some ways there's a whole lot we could learn from other nations. Why is it that Japan has 10 deaths per year from gunshots, whereas in the United States 120 people die from guns every day? That's 45,000 people a year. So what can we learn from Japan? What can we learn from Australia, that had a huge buyback program years ago after the slaughter of about 30 people in Tasmania? What can we learn from the approach that New Zealand has taken? So it is a U.S. issue, and believe me, our international friends would say, "What is wrong, people? What?" They'd like to teach us some lessons. So I would hope for that. And Christianity is a radical religion. And so, as Shane Claiborne says, we believe in a God who would rather die than kill. We believe in a God whose last words are grace and forgiveness for the people who are killing him. We believe in a God who interacts with evil without becoming evil, who exposes our violence to heal our violence, who endures death to save us from death. We are atheists to the God of war and believers in the Prince of Peace. That's a pretty radical approach. That's beat your swords into plowshares kind of thing. That's a creative, prophetic message. But at the same time, I believe that with my different experience, and I can stand right beside Tim and say, there's so many practical things. Let's not argue about whether you own a gun or not. Let's argue about whether you should have to register, whether you should be required to have training, what age should people have guns. We live in a nation where we need the Tims to have that kind of profession to work together for a less violent nation.
And I agree with, so in most of the things we brought up, there's already laws on the books that gun ownership, to own a long gun typically is 18. To purchase a pistol is 21. There are courses you're supposed to do and steps you have to go through to make those purchases. At 18, you're classified as an adult in the United States. You're not a child anymore, and you can vote. They expect you to make adult decisions. Brother David brought up the point about military veterans. And I agree that a lot of them die by their own gun, and primarily that's a mental health problem that we as a nation haven't addressed very well, unfortunately. And our veterans who have returned from multiple engagements in combat environments, which are extremely stressful, we haven't reintegrated them into society and helped them deal with the trauma that they experienced overseas. And in that regards, we failed them. And they basically choose a final solution to a temporary circumstance. And they see no way out and they have no hope. And so then they take their own lives. And it's terrible. There's no easy fix for any of these. Because one of the things I learned in law enforcement is the minute we change the law or we think we fixed a loophole, those who are destined to do criminal acts are going to find their ways around it. Every one of these quote unquote mass shootings that we've talked about today so far, all of them were an illegal act. Firearms in a school, it's illegal to bring a firearm into a school, whether you're a student or an adult, unless you're a law enforcement professional who's there for law enforcement business. Bringing a firearm into a bar, you're actually, if you have a firearm in a bar, you're not supposed to drink. But that's on the books. That's a law in almost every state that I'm aware of. So in each of these instances, we're talking about people who have committed and were planning to commit a criminal act. And so again, there's no easy answers. Banning firearms may or may not fix the problem, but it opens up a completely different set of potential problems when we go to that drastic extreme. I think, as Brother Dave said, part of it is a heart issue. We've lost the ability as individuals and as a nation to have a discourse where it's a discussion and you can disagree without being angry, and without where it's actually a discussion, it's a conversation, and you find your common ground rather than what divides you. And we're not set up for that anymore. And so the minute people disagree with one another now, they want to come to blows. They want to use fists or knives or guns. And that, obviously, that's inappropriate. It's not the way to work. And even us as a church, when we disagree, or in my experience, in a lot of cases, when we disagree, rather than finding ways to come together, we just separate ourselves. I'll go start my own congregation. I'm going to go to a different church, because whether I'm in faithful disagreement with you or not, I just don't disagree. I just don't agree with you. And so now I don't want to interact with you. It's not an effective solution. We do need to figure out how to reconcile with one another and how to have these discussions and still love one another through our differences, so that we can include all these perspectives and still move forward as a peaceful movement. In my experience with the church many years ago, while I was an active duty military member, there was a strong contingent within the church, both domestically and internationally, who felt that being in the military was absolutely wrong, and that we should either not serve in the military, end our military service, or not be members of the church. I've also experienced that same perspective as a law enforcement professional, where members of the church felt I've had it on both ways. Don't get me wrong. I've had it where people welcome the fact that there are people out there willing to protect them so they can pursue peace. Even in very dangerous situations, there's somebody there to let them move forward with that olive branch. And I've also experienced the other perspective where, because I'm in law enforcement, we shouldn't be in law enforcement. That's not pursuing peace. That's just enforcing justice, and it's earthly justice, and we shouldn't be involved in that. And so they felt that I shouldn't be a member of the church. Obviously, I just agreed to disagree and continued what I thought was my ministry and faithful service to, again, my fellow citizens and my fellow disciples, domestic disciples and international disciples.
Yeah. I'll first say, I appreciate you sharing that, Tim, because that moment, kind of maybe a vulnerability there, because I will admit that I am one of those people that at times have had kind of a knee-jerk reaction and frustration, and when it comes to thoughts about military service and police force and stuff like that, and I've struggled with that in my own feelings in response to that, and never want to somebody be put into a situation where you as somebody who responds in service in different ways, that to feel ostracized because of that. And I think that gets back to the scripture I mentioned a little while ago from 161 in the Doctrine and Covenants. To become a people of the temple who see violence, proclaim peace, who feel conflict, yet extend the hand of reconciliation, and who encounter broken spirits and find pathways for healing. And as we look at maybe solutions for what this is as a faithful response to the issue, I think that, what you brought up about we need to learn to talk with each other and we need to learn to listen. And I think that's part of what that scripture is getting at, is that we need to, I've said, I've talked with congregations, like, what can we do in our community? I said, provide space for your community to come together to talk about issues that matter in your community. That's one of the best things I think that you can just simple you can do that costs no money, that can bring people together. And this is one of those issues that I think would be important to come together and bring, provide space to come together in our communities and have conversations and listen to one another. I moved from Seattle 10 years ago down to Southern Oregon, very different culture than Seattle. And that was very helpful for me to I think in my journey to maybe expand kind of my way of thinking about some things. Not that I changed necessarily my views on some things, but it helped me become a better listener of other views and of other perspectives in some of these conversations.
Like Carla, I'm a Kansan by birth, and I grew up on ranches and farms, and so we had guns for hunting pheasants and quail and duck and that kind of thing. So I have a little background in that perspective and that worldview that says, yeah, hunting happens and that kind of thing. I know how polarized this topic is in our nation right now. What are we not polarized about? Good Lord. But this year, as I was driving through Kansas, I thought, I have never been to the Eisenhower Museum. And so I decided I'm going to do that. And knowing about his role in World War II and as president, I found it very interesting to read a quote from Eisenhower that goes like this: "Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies in the final sense a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children." And so when I think about my role, our role as a Christian denomination, as followers of the Prince of Peace, I know we've got a long way to go, and sometimes I despair, as you mentioned, Carla. But we do what we do. We join the groups that literally take guns and make plowshares or garden tools or musical instruments as a symbol of what can be done. We work on legislation that may help us to get just one step further. And I've been involved quite a bit in Oregon the last 5 years of working hard to establish legislation and policies that might save one more life, 2 more lives, 10 more lives. There's still a lot of work to do. There's a lot of work we can do together, no matter where we stand on the political spectrum. There are a lot of conversations like this kind of conversation that need to be held, and I'm grateful for it.
I really appreciate this entire conversation. Sometimes I do what has been mentioned here, and like when it's too much, I just shut down and like separate myself out, and that is not a good thing to do, like Tim mentioned. And I do actually believe and think that we have to come together as a community. I'm going to quote another Doctrine and Covenant scripture. I don't even know where it's from. It's, I don't know, 163, 4, 5, one of those. And it talks about building community is painful and even arduous at times. And this is probably even farther down that road of pain and arduousness to have a conversation in a community to talk about this very issue, because people are so passionate about it. But I actually do think that the community aspect is probably going to be the thing that's going to save us. And that's just me talking. I don't know the answer, of course, but I'm thinking that it is the community that we have to work with in order to make some changes that need to be changed in this. So Tim, I really appreciated those comments a lot. Dave, I appreciate your comments very much as well. I promised that this would only be about 30 minutes, and we've almost reached our 30-minute time limit because I don't want to hold everybody too long. So I'm going to ask for some final thoughts from our 3 guests. I mean, Sean is my co-host, but also a guest. So are there any final thoughts about what is our faithful response to gun violence?
Well, I'll say 2 things. One is let's do the research and think about practical solutions. Like, what about voluntary gun buybacks to reduce the pool of 400 million guns in America? What about warning labels on guns, cautioning that a firearm increases the risk of gun death in households? What about a tax on guns to cover some of the external costs of their misuse? What about universal background checks to buy ammunition? How about waiting periods or a limit of 2 gun purchases a month per person? Those kinds of practical things to address. But finally, I would say, what about this dream, prophetic dream, in the words of Zechariah, who said, "The city streets will be filled with boys and girls playing. No one will make them afraid." That's my dream. That's our dream. That's what we want to work toward.
And I agree with that dream. I would uphold that dream and work faithfully, and have worked faithfully towards that my entire adult life. Because that is the dream of Zion, isn't it? Unfortunately, we live in a world that is broken, and that has many people who have no idea how to find the wholeness that we find in our faith journey. And so we have to stand in the gap for those who want to pursue that dream as they are now, and those who are broken and are bent on violence. And so we have to do both. We have to continue to pursue that pursuit of peace and yet have someone standing in the gap, protecting the flock from the predators that would devastate it if it had the opportunity.
And I'll just, lift up what I've shared already about and echoed of what has been said by others about we need to come to the table, we need to come together, and we need to be able to work through these issues together. Because at the end of the day, it's what we owe the families of those who have lost loved ones to gun violence, the families of those kids in Uvalde, and all those other communities that have lost, especially young ones, to gun violence. We have to do better.
We do have to do better. I'm getting emotional because I feel your intensity from all of you, and me too, about this topic. And I hope that those who are listening felt your passion for it as well. And that it does seem like we all have the same dream and that it's our job to come together to discuss it. And I'm very grateful that you all came to discuss it here. I know there was a lot of anxiousness coming into this conversation, and I so appreciate what you had to say. I appreciate your vulnerability. I appreciate your views. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you, Carla.
Carla.
Thank you.
Thanks to all of you. Appreciate the conversation.